l'événement d'aujourd'hui et de demain est organisé par le fonds AMF en gestion intégrée des risques, qui est un fonds de recherche dont je suis titulaire et qui existe depuis à peine 3 ans, ou enfin 2 ans d'exercice effectif. Et donc, c'est le premier événement qu'on organise et j'en remercie les conférenciers qui vont nous faire leur présentation ce matin, cet après-midi et demain. Le sujet, évidemment, est ce qu'on appelle d'actualité et donc j'ai pas besoin d'insister sur l'importance de la réflexion qui peut être faite sur un sujet du genre. Et il y a en fait, quand on regarde dans tous les domaines, il y a un énorme effort de réflexion et de recherche sur ce genre de sujet. Just for those who did not look at the recent program change, tomorrow Professor Taylor's presentation has been moved from 12:30 to 1:30. So this allows you to take a break of 1 hour between the two conferences tomorrow. So let me start with today's first presentation. John Galbraith from McGill University is specialized in econometrics, financial econometrics, macroeconomics. He is well known. He has published a lot. He is, in particular, well known in Quebec as a fellow of Cyrano, a research center which regroups many universities, and also a member of CIREC, which is a research center on quantitative economics. He's a former president of la Société canadienne de sciences économiques, which is the French-speaking counterpart of the Canadian Economic Association. He is a former co-editor of the Canadian Journal of Economics, and he's a very well known economist in the Quebec Society, or Canadian Society, I should say. He has published on many subjects, and in particular, this what he will be presenting today is really topical, and I'm quite happy to have him here presenting this paper. It turns out that what John will be presenting is actually useful for the next presentation. This was not planned, but I think there is a sort of sequence, and so it will be useful for the next presentation as well. So please go ahead, John. Maybe we are a bit not yet 9:30.
Well, that's okay, Claude. That gives me just a moment to thank you. So thank you for the invitation. Good. So I believe you can see my title page slide at this point. Please let me know if not. Great. Yes. Thank you, Claude. So this is joint work with David Bougny and Youssouf Kamara from Telecom Paris. And we've been working on a number of papers connected with this. Let me begin by, how will I make this go forward? Things are not working so straightforwardly as I had hoped. There we go. Let me begin by thanking the Groupement des Cartes Bancaires CB, which has provided data to David, who is the primary contact under the auspices of his research chair in digital finance. This is a very rich data source, as I will describe, and it's really made possible a variety of different studies. So we're very grateful for the access that they have provided to these data, which I think serves an important public policy function. So here's an overview of the talk then. I want to just give an indication of what we think we are, or what we hope we are achieving in these studies. And I want to spend a bit of time on a number of different research questions. I think that given the time today, perhaps the most useful thing I can do is give a flavor of the variety of different questions that we can answer with these data, some of which are, I think, straightforward that you would immediately think of, and some perhaps less so. So I'll then begin. I see there are questions in the chat. Now, this is just like teaching on Zoom. Okay, nothing I need to react to yet. Like teaching on Zoom, I become distracted by questions more easily than in a classroom. So in order to discuss the pandemic period, we have to just mention a few key dates for this study. Some of what I will present will deal with the containment in France approximately a year ago, and some of the data will cover the entire year 2020. But I need to review some features of the carte bancaire data, which we will be working with and which are important as indicators of what can be obtained in studies of this type. And then I just want to go over a number of the results that we've got in pursuing some of these research questions. So there's the monitoring of the macroeconomy and the general consumption dynamics through this period, which again, I think is something that one would naturally think of doing, but it's important, I believe, for policymakers. And then some things that are not so clear a priori that one could achieve, but where I think there are a number of interesting results. So these concern the physical movements of consumers and the degree to which we can measure a response of consumer movements to restrictions, consumer adaptation to the shock that took place with respect to the pandemic. I'll say a bit more about that in a while, but I think that essentially response to extreme shocks is something that is it's very important for us and perhaps is going to become more important as time goes on. We just saw, for example, the last couple of days that a major fuel pipeline has been shut down by criminals in the United States, and that is potentially going to have very disruptive effects. We see extreme events arising from weather, from hurricanes, from what have you. Society is vulnerable in many ways to extreme shocks, and the ways in which we can adapt and keep the economy moving will play an important role in our resilience to these shocks. So this is a theme that I will want to emphasize. We will then say something about differences across sectors of the economy and what that tells us about the ability to loss transactions, in a sense, so that this economy in some sectors may not be entirely lost during the pandemic. A little bit about regional effect is something we've studied a little bit. We have results there. And then just very brief, because of course we can't say anything.
Monsieur Galbraith, je crois que vous avez des problèmes à vous entendre avec votre Wi-Fi présentement. La connexion semble être moins bonne. Je ne sais pas si c'est la salle où vous vous trouvez ou l'endroit.
Ah.
On vous perd par moment. On voit les barres.
OK. Ah. OK. Mon faille ici est très bon, mais je vais changer de place pour essayer ça. Pardon. On va voir si c'est mieux.
Désolé de vous avoir coupé.
Donc, vous allez avoir un petit tour de ma maison ici. Pas nécessairement ce qu'on veut. Mais, donc, est-ce que c'est mieux maintenant, pensez-vous?
Oui, le son est revenu et ça m'indique que votre Wi-Fi est plus puissant ici.
OK, ben, je ne sais pas s'il y a un effet causal ou non, mais en tout cas, oh, sorry, I was speaking in English, forgot. Yes, I'm not sure if there's any causal effect of my movement or not, but in any event, here we are. Okay, so an overview then of what we're doing. We have time-stamped transaction data, which I will describe in more detail in a little while. So it's natural to use those for real-time monitoring, and this is something that has been important for policymakers, I think. One of the traditional problems that we've faced in macroeconomic management has been the long time lag between our data arriving and the time period to which it applied, and therefore the reaction lags in policymaking. So it's natural to use these timestamp data to attempt to do real-time monitoring. Nowcasting is one of the byproducts of this. So that's important, and we're going to do that. But as I was saying a minute ago, there are numerous other aspects of consumer response to an extreme shock that we can look at. And we think these are very interesting. And there are a number of things that we can, if not fully explore, at least gain some insights into through the use of these data. So I want to give some emphasis to that. So these data come from France. There have been a number of studies that have come out using transaction data in different countries. So there are Chinese data, Chen et al., Danish data, Anderson et al., Spanish data from one of the large banks there, BBVA, Carvalho et al., and the US, Baker et al., using data from a fintech company. There's also a UK study, the reference to which I was not able to find in the last day or two when I was looking, but which also uses fintech data from the UK. So I want to emphasize some important features of the data from Groupement des Cartes CB. And in particular, I want to emphasize coverage and representativeness of the data. So here are some research questions that I will give a flavor, at least, of today, with the goal of, I hope, interesting you in some of the things that we can learn from these data rather than explaining or exploring each of them in detail. So first, of course, monitoring. As I say, this is a relatively straightforward thing to do using time aggregated data to observe in real time the evolution of consumption. But even here, there are some things that one might not necessarily have expected, in that we can get daily or even higher frequency results looking at changes in the hourly pattern, for example, of transactions through the period of the pandemic. Most importantly, though, I think this is something that's important as an input to policymakers, and it's straightforward in a sense to think of doing it, but very useful. Something that is less straightforward, but I think very, very interesting, is mobility. So how did the pandemic and containment restrictions affect consumers' movements throughout France? And what we can essentially do is track people's movements through their card transaction purchases. Whenever a purchase is made, we will observe the location and the timestamp, and that will allow us, as we'll see shortly, to provide a measure, well, various measures of how people have moved through France, and therefore how the pandemic restrictions actually impacted the distribution of mobilities across different individuals. Next, shock mitigation. Again, I think that resiliency to shocks is an extremely interesting and important phenomenon. And one thing that we can study here is the degree to which consumers were able to mitigate the effects of the containment through two forms, essentially, of adaptation. One is the move to online purchases. So what we tend to observe, to anticipate a bit, is that the availability of online shopping allowed consumers to blunt the impact of the containment policies to some degree, therefore reduce the effect on the overall economy, so that there is some increase in the resiliency of the economy to the shock as a result of this. We'll also see that that evolved over time. We'll also see that there are channels for intertemporal substitution in some sectors. So there are regional effects, which we think are interesting, and which may have some implications which are not so favorable, that I'll draw attention to. The impact of the movements online will have an effect on the relative, or we think it may have an effect, let me say, we have fairly early results, may have an effect on the distribution of economic activity throughout a country. And then the point that I mentioned just a moment ago, the recouping of lost transactions. Consumers can, in some areas, postpone transactions. So with respect to buying food from a grocery store, that's not so. Food in 2 months is not a good substitute for food right now when you're hungry. But if you're buying a washing machine, that may be fine. You may be able to continue to use a durable good for some period of time. So by looking at different sectors of the economy, which these data allow us to do, we can look at differential consumption dynamics. And that tells us something about the ways in which consumers are responding to the shock, where the nature of the good permits them to do so. So again, we think that this has some very interesting information to convey about the adaptation of consumers to the shock. So finally, we can't state very much about this yet, of course, because the long term has not taken place, so to speak. But we're interested in whether there are long-term changes arising as consumers have simply learned about or overcome resistance to online shopping, and whether this is going to imply some lasting, even permanent changes in consumer behavior. And there are some early indications that that may be the case. So just quickly, you're all familiar with the dates of the pandemic. I suppose a section of this type will be more useful for people looking back at these papers 10 or 20 years from now. But essentially, because we're dealing with data from France, the most important dates are the dates of the first and major lockdown that took place, which was announced around 12th through 16th of March and continued for roughly a couple of months, April, May, June, 3 months, sorry, to the first deconfinement. Later in the year, there was a second confinement, a second lockdown, if you like, roughly speaking, November through mid-December. So although the main results that I'm going to concentrate on this morning concern this primary lockdown period where the shock was unanticipated and intense, we have some results, and again, as time permits, we will look at a later period to a limited extent. In any event, the main period of interest to us this morning is mid-March through late June for the key phase of the lockdown. So these data, the data set is very rich, as I say, and importantly, the nature of the French banking system, similar, I would say in this respect to the Canadian system, but as opposed to the American, relatively concentrated, relatively small number of large financial institutions. And as in Canada, there are some smaller financial institutions as well. The carte bancaire scheme covers over 100 of them. There are 70 million cards in use and nearly 2 million merchants associated with these schemes. So it has very, very broad coverage of the economy and of the individuals within the economy. And it's also important, I think, that these are cards that most people use. Clearly, there are 70 million of them in use. These are not modes of payment that are disproportionately used by young, tech-savvy, highly educated people, for example, as with some methods of money transfer that are known to probably my children, but not to me. Most people in France are covered, and the people with these cards are typical French citizens. They are not a selected group. So it's a very, very representative sample in this respect. There are about 10 billion transactions per year that we can observe, and each of them includes a card identifier. We do not, I note, have individuals' identities, so there's no question of matching. Confidentiality laws restrict that, of course. There's no question of matching with individual characteristics such as income. But there are things that we can deduce from it. So we can identify the card uniquely so that as a card moves throughout France making purchases, we are able to observe that particular card. We do not know whose card it is. Each transaction also contains the identity of the merchant. the category of expenditure, which, as we'll see later, will be quite useful to us, I think, in making these sectoral distinctions that help us to describe the differential consumer adaptation across different types of item that the consumer may need. So we have the precise geographical location, and we have the value of the purchase, and we have the exact time. In some data that I've worked with of this type, we have transactions at a time when they clear between banks. That is not the case here. Here we have the timestamp of the transaction itself. So there's no question of transactions clearing at the end of the day or something of this type. We're observing, as is commonplace in these transaction data, we're observing transactions when they clear between two different financial institutions, so that when the merchant and the cardholder are dealing with the same bank, people in this business call that an on-us transaction. So there's no fee passing between the banks for use of the terminal. Those are not in the data set because an interbank transaction does not arise. But in general, that should not affect the representativeness of the sample. It's unlikely, I think, that individuals choose a merchant based on the matching of the financial institution that the merchant uses. The individual doesn't know that in general. I don't know that when I make a purchase using a card, and it doesn't affect the cost to the consumer. So for the present results, we're essentially making 2019-2020 comparisons using the period just before the lockdown and the period during the lockdown. And I will show you graphically the comparison between those years in the pre-lockdown period, and they're very, very similar as you would expect in their aggregate characteristics. And then we'll observe the lockdown period, and econometrically we'll look at some difference in different specifications to try to deduce what's going on. So we'll begin with the monitoring and consumption dynamics. At this point, I'll ask Claude if you would be so kind to give me a warning, Claude, when I'm perhaps within 15 minutes of the end of the time, since my screen is taken up with other things.
Okay, sure.
Can't see a clock.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm first going to just indicate graphically some features that we learn concerning monitoring. So aggregate daily consumption value or volume, perhaps the quantity that would be most interesting to policymakers and which could be incorporated into a nowcasting model. But I'll also show you some things that are less familiar. So that first line here is something that central banks are now doing, using aggregate daily card data for monitoring. But the intraday dynamics are also interesting. We see some changes in patterns during the pandemic, and we can also see weekly dynamics, which are interesting in and of themselves. So I'll just show you briefly some of the things that we can observe from these data where we are able to track even hourly expenditures. So we'll compare the 2019 and 2020 periods in the pre-pandemic phase of these 2 years, so January to the 15th of March, roughly, and then the same comparison from the 16th of March through the 11th of May in the data that I'm going to present this morning. And some results will go on later, and then I'll show you roughly some annual results just to give you the broad scope of what happened throughout the year. So these results I sometimes describe in the way we speak now as the low-hanging fruit in these data. But the low-hanging fruit are important. This economic monitoring is of great value to policymakers. And then later we'll move on to some trickier things. So here are daily consumption fluctuations comparing 2019 and 2020. So always 2019 is the black line and 2020 is the red line. So we see that in the period before the first lockdown, the 2 years matched very, very well. There are slight increases in economic activity observable in 2020 in line with general modest growth of the economy. And then the lockdown takes place and we see this very precipitous decline in expenditures. And gradually we see consumers clawing their way back toward the end of this period. We'll look at different aggregates of these data later, which will make some of these effects clearer. And we'll also make the online-offline distinction. So here we have value of transactions, and here we have volume of transactions. Already we see one interesting phenomenon, which you would have anticipated, and that is that the volume is changed even more than the value, so that consumers were tending to aggregate their purchases. The value of purchases declined less than the number of times, if you like, they made a purchase. They were tending to do more things at once when they went into a store, as we would expect. Here's some intraday patterns. So my co-author David likes to call this a hat graph, I think. Looks like a Stetson, I suppose. And again, 2020, 2019, before the pandemic, just the usual pattern you would expect of slow growth in the economy, but otherwise everything is the same between the 2 years. During the pandemic containment period, of course, we see declines through 2020, but we also see a decline of the pattern within the day. There is a reduction in the afternoon shopping hours. So here we have the hours from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. in this period, 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., let's say. There is more of a reduction in the afternoon hours than in the morning hours. So that will have some interaction, of course, with online effects and the fact that some of this activity is being transferred online as opposed to taking place in the shops. And in later data, which I probably won't be presenting this morning, but you can see the increase in shopping around midnight, for example, in 2020 relative to 2019, as people are shopping online and therefore carrying out some of their activities at times when stores are otherwise closed. Intra-week, again, we see that, and this is important, by the way, for later difference in difference results, we again see that the 2019-2020 patterns are very similar. In the period before the containment, there's nothing to indicate that these 2 years differ in any substantial way, apart from just the general growth of the economy, modest and regular way. And during the pandemic period, we see the weekly patterns changed quite a bit. We see within each of the days of the week, we see this decline in the afternoon spike relative to the morning spike. And we see substantially different weekend patterns as well, where there's a particularly strong change through some of the weekends. Okay, so that is, I think, very useful and interesting material for policymakers, allowing them to do some real-time monitoring. And as I say, attack this traditional problem that we've had in economics, that our monitoring of the economy lags the actual events. And so a lot of transaction data are being used in many countries now to do some real-time monitoring. So that's great, and this helps a lot. But now on to some questions that are tougher to get at, where some of the features of these data, I think, really shine and really allow us to see some new and interesting things. So these data are such that each transaction, as I say, has a precise timestamp, and that means that the transactions are ordered in time. You made this transaction, then your next one was here, your next one was there, your next one was somewhere else. And that means, because we also have the geographical locations of the merchants, we can track the sequence of purchases in order made by each card. And we can then compute a measure of the distances traveled between each pair of transactions. What we then do is define a home location. So in some data sets, one needs to use a legal definition, in a sense, or an administrative definition of a home location. What we do here is something that I think is preferable, probably, but it's in any event what we do. We define a home location as the location in which the largest number of transactions is recorded. So it may or may not be your legal residence, but it's the place where you are most often, in a sense. So this is defined as your home city or town and home département. So of course, France is divided into départements. There are about 95 of them, depending on whether you're counting the territoire outre-mer or not. I've forgotten the exact number if you do, but we're dealing with the metropolitan France here, with the European France. So we are able to observe transactions that take place out of the home city or out of the home département. So we're able to indicate cases in which the individual is, in some sense, traveling. So What I'm now going to do then is indicate some graphs showing the effect of the pandemic restrictions on measures of consumers' movements throughout France. So I'm going to show some distribution functions, essentially, or density functions, as the case may be, to describe the ways in which across different cards, we see different numbers of kilometers moved, or numbers of cities visited, or different values of expenditure outside home. So how did this evolve when the pandemic restrictions took place? Of course, one of the main mechanisms by which the lockdown restrictions were intended to combat the virus was by reducing consumers' movements. So here we can have some direct observations on the movements of consumers in order to judge the degree to which these restrictions were effective. And I think we see some very interesting things. So once again, the pre-pandemic period on the left and the period of the lockdown on the right. Notice that the scales are different. So the peak over here on the left-hand graphic is the peak over here on the right-hand graphic, more or less. So here we have the distances by travel, distances by card traveled in 10-kilometer intervals between the 2 years. So we see many cards traveled only very short distances, and then the distances drop off in a regular way, more or less monotonically, as we go to higher and higher distances. 2019 and 2020 before the lockdown are virtually identical in this density. And now we look at the lockdown period, and what we see is that the density of distances traveled is shifted very far towards small distances. So now the peak at very small distances traveled is approximately 3 times as high, and the number of cards traveling long distances is much, much lower. I suppose I could blow up this little area here so you could see this, but the ratio is quite high between these two graphs. There are still a few people in the data set, it's interesting, who are traveling a large number of kilometers during this period, but many fewer than before. And for a very large number of people, the number of miles traveled or the number of kilometers traveled has been reduced very substantially. Number of cities visited. Once again, on the left, we see 2019, 2020, before the lockdown, very similar results. The majority of people are visiting maybe around 5 different cities, and there are a few people that go to a very large number of places. Once again, the lockdown restrictions are having a big effect. Now, the modal value is just one. That the card has just been used in one place. In fact, nearly 40% of cards are just used in one place now, following these restrictions, and the number of people going very long distance, or even to, even visiting 10 cities, there is almost no one left in the data set who is doing that, whereas about 5% of people almost were visiting 10 cities beforehand. So we're seeing very, very substantial effects of the lockdown restrictions on mobility, and we're able to measure these. The proportion by the value of consumption expenditures made outside the home city. So again, 2019, 2020, quite similar. During the lockdown period, again, notice the difference in scales. So on the left-hand side, this peaks around 12%. The proportion of cards, 0.6, 0.7 is the peak value. During the lockdown period, so mid-March to mid-May in this case, nearly 40% have a proportion of 0, and there are very few people making a large proportion of their expenditures outside the home city. Okay, so this is one thing that we think is very interesting. You can get data of this type also to some extent from GPS telephone records. So this operates, of course, on a different principle. I guess we see these as complementary types of information. Obviously, the telephone movement data are very interesting also. They have a somewhat different character. The telephone data can be opted out of, and increasingly it seems people will be doing that. Apple and Facebook are currently, I guess, having a bit of a tiff over whether it's beneficial or not to let people explicitly make that choice or whatever the change is that's taking place. Some people will opt out of sharing those data. Some people don't have smartphones. But similar sorts of information can be obtained from these different sources. Here, however, we're observing every transaction that is taking place among these 70 million cards through this period. So I think this is a high quality of information about consumer movements, and we're getting a very clear indication of the degree to which the mobility, the lockdown restrictions really had an impact on consumer mobility. I mean, obviously they were very well respected. A large number of people went nowhere, essentially, and that this was one of the mechanisms by which the lockdown was having an effect. Number of retailers, similar story. Outside the home city, the modal value is 0 outside the home city. Okay. Now, some model-based results in which we're going to use some different specifications to try to measure numerically some of the effects of the lockdown period. And in particular, I'll show you also some graphics to indicate, I hope more intuitively, some of the things we can see from these data. But online point of sale substitution is a very important theme that runs through this, both because of what it tells us about our ability to mitigate the effects of the shocks and therefore augment the resilience of the economy, but also because of what it tells us about technology adoption and potential long-term changes arising from the forced learning that is taking place through this period. And we're going to see again sectoral differences in the degree to which intertemporal substitution is possible, the delay of purchases, and we'll see some regional effects. Claude, how am I doing for time?
Doing fine. You still have 30 minutes.
Thank you.
Or even 35 or so.
Okay, thank you. That's just perfect. Okay. So I'm going to present only a few numbers this morning because it's hard, I think, to read numbers when someone is presenting, and I'll try to indicate some graphics, but I will present a few numbers. I think they make clear that these results are very strong in the sense that the effects are large. They're easy to detect. So we're going to look at some difference in different specifications, essentially to make a numerical comparison analogous to the graphical comparisons that we've just been looking at. So we take a pre-pandemic period comparing 2019 and 2020. Model validity or validity of the specification requires that in the pre-pandemic period, so we're going to take differences in the 2 years and then differences across the pre-pandemic versus lockdown period. Validity requires that the 2 years be similar in the pre-shock period. And graphically, I think we've seen that that is the case, up to just very small evolution in the value of transactions in the economy. The patterns are essentially identical. And then we'll try to deduce something about what happened in the lockdown period, to deduce the effects of the lockdown, and of course, to measure the effects. It's clear that the effects are substantial, but to measure these effects numerically. So essentially, we have a variable here indicating, a binary variable indicating the period of the lockdown, and this coefficient will give us an indicator of the magnitude of the effect. Okay, and these are logarithmic results, so this is going to be something like percentage changes that are going to emerge from this kind of study. Okay. Again, I'll try to indicate intuitively what I think are the interesting things that emerge from this, and I'll summarize later on our rough answers, if you like, to these research questions that we posed earlier. So in the results that I've shown you so far, we're essentially measuring and observing directly, and now we're attempting to deduce numerically some sizes of effects. And we're going to start to look at online-offline comparisons, and then I'll try to share a different screen and show you some other graphics at some point. So we see that both value and volume of daily card expenditure were quite stable across the pre-containment dates, so from January 1st through about the 15th of March in 2019-2020. And so beta post is the variable that's of interest, or the coefficient that's of interest to us here. It's an estimated average containment expenditure response, if you like, relative to the control value. So our sort of validity of inference check on the difference in difference specification is that the pre-pandemic differential between the 2 years should be approximately 0. Ideally, it should be statistically indistinguishable from 0. That's close to being the case. So here are just a few numbers. I'm not going to put up too many numbers today, as I say, because I think that's hard to read, but just perhaps one or two tables to indicate, I think, the general character of these results. So offline and online comparison now. I'll begin to pay some attention to that theme. So the pre-pandemic number, we want this to be near 0. For offline, it is. Online, it's not literally 0, but the numbers are small. So the validity of inference check looks pretty good. For offline, it is just great. For online, there's perhaps a little something there, but not too much. Relative to the containment effect, these effects are certainly trivial. So offline, value of transactions, there's just a huge decline. As of course we all know. What we'll see, however, which is interesting momentarily, is that there are big differences across sectors of the economy, and these differences, I think, are revealing for the ways in which consumers have adapted to the containment. Online, now there's a lot of evolution of this over time. Again, so this is an aggregate value over this period. Online, in this first containment, the value of transactions went down as well. So that may be a bit surprising at first, but in the initial shock of the containment, even online purchases declined. But there's a differential pattern of recovery across online and offline. And again, I'll show you a graph of that in a minute. But we see globally here, we see very large containment effects. The other thing that we observe, which I hinted at in the graphic that we saw earlier, was that the value per transaction is also significantly higher, both online and offline, but particularly online. When people were going into stores, they were buying more when they did so, trying to economize on the number of trips to stores that they made, as of course makes perfect sense. Now, I'm having a hard time seeing the button that makes the screen go forward. There, that appears to be it. Sorry, I just have to check that I've not missed anything. Okay, here is a weekly aggregate now for point of sale transactions during this period. So here we are before the restrictions take place, and relative to the previous year, nothing much is happening. The restrictions kick in mid-March. Point of sale transactions plummet. We're down here at minus 60% roughly, and slowly claw their way back part way. Okay. Online, again, things are burbling along. They also plummet, not as much, but they go down a great deal at the beginning of the pandemic. People are presumably shocked, but the value of transactions fully recovers essentially quite quickly, and later on, of course, increases to beyond previous levels. And I'll show you sectoral results in a little while. I think that, as I say, are quite revealing about this. So the pattern of online and offline transactions is already observed to be different, even during the peak period of this shock of the lockdown, the containment restrictions in France. We're seeing an evolution of a movement toward online purchasing, a quicker recovery of online purchasing through this period. Now, let's look at some sectoral results, which I've been mentioning, which I think are very interesting. So before we do that, let's just think about what we would be expecting to see, or what we might be interested in examining. So the aggregate results indicate that online expenditure was less severely affected and recovered more quickly. In the sample that we have here, we don't yet observe it exceeding previous levels, but in some longer data that I'll show you shortly, we do. But there is an indication in these later data of substitution of online for point of sale in these individual sectors. Now, the data set that we have indicates codes for the type of consumer expenditure. And one of the important distinctions that took place or that was made in the law in France with respect to the containment restrictions was the distinction between essential and non-essential services or stores, transactions, so that non-essential stores were essentially shut down. And we see that in a number of sectors of the economy, point of sale purchases essentially stopped dead for a period during this containment, whereas essential services such as food stores remained open. And of course, as we will all have heard, purchases of food in fact increased during the pandemic as restaurants were shut down. So we can look at the essential, non-essential distinction and types of expenditure within those classifications. The thing that I want to draw attention to today is the distinction between durable and non-durable goods within the non-essential category. And the reason for that is that with durable goods, there is the potential for intertemporal substitution. So as I said earlier, if you're buying food, you're hungry now, you need food now, you can't say, well, I'll get some food, in a couple of months. But if it's a washing machine, unless your washing machine is completely broken, and even then you can probably wait for a while, you can probably hold out for a couple of months before you buy a new washing machine or a new car or a new television or what have you. So we expect to see one dimension along which consumers can mitigate the effects of shocks being intertemporal substitution. So let's first look, though, at some of the coefficients. So this is this coefficient that I drew attention to earlier. It's our indicator of the effect taking place during the pandemic period, this coefficient on the dummy for the pandemic period, measuring value of transactions, and first looking at essential sectors. So we notice here that we're seeing approximately, I guess, what we might expect. Pharmacies, there's essentially no effect. First of all, looking at point of sale, let me just stick to point of sale for a moment. Pharmacies, there's essentially no effect. Bakeries, down. People were aggregating their shopping, presumably, into larger trips, which they could do at grocery stores, and perhaps, going to pâtisserie less often for things they would consider perhaps non-essential. I'm a little surprised that in France, I must say, croissant and pain au chocolat are perhaps considered by consumers not critical, but the data seem to say that. Anyway, grocery purchases are up. When we compare total expenditures and point of sale in each of these cases, they're pretty close, indicating that online expenditures, we have data on this in one of the papers, but online expenditures were quite a small proportion of overall activity in these cases. So the total and the point of sale are very similar. So if we look at the increase in online expenditures, again, this is structured because it's a logarithmic regression. These are indicators of percentage changes. So this is more like a 100% increase, very roughly speaking. So these are very large percentage increases, but the total amount of online activity before the lockdown was very small. So these large percentage increases are relatively small total increases. So globally, what we see is that in these essential sectors, things did not change too dramatically, except that people are doing more shopping in grocery stores. They're not going to restaurants and perhaps spending less time in more specialized establishments where they would buy food. Okay. For really essential things like pharmacies, nothing much changes. There's a more online ordering, but that was a small percentage in general. Okay. Some non-essential sectors. So total expenditure essentially plummets in most of these sectors. It's interesting that information technology equipment falls least. So these coefficients near -1 are very roughly speaking interpretable as a near 100% fall. In other words, point of sale expenditures essentially dry up. You just aren't going to clothing stores because they're not open. You're not buying shoes in stores, it can't be done. Total expenditures are similar again to point of sale expenditures, far from identical. There was a substantial amount of online activity going on beforehand. The increases in online in percentage terms are large, but the total impact on that is relatively modest. Although in IT equipment and appliances, we're seeing the largest percentage increases. Of course, we're seeing a reflection of the degree to which it is easy to make a choice online. Footwear, presumably, is one of the things that is hardest to buy online because of the importance of a precise fit. Whereas, Whereas if you want a washing machine and you know what you want, you can presumably get it online. I want to go right now, I think, to the graphics to show that. But the point to retain, I guess, from these numerical measures is that the pandemic restrictions were highly effective in essentially stopping point of sale purchases. The stores just closed, and that's that. Total expenditures were similarly affected because online expenditure was, at least initially, quite modest. So though there were large percentage increases in online expenditure, the initial effect was fairly modest. But we see the evolution of that over time. Now, what I want to do now is go to an auxiliary file with some more graphics. So that entails a new screen share, which I know from my classes frequently involves something a little bit tricky, but I'm going to try to do it. And there we are. So I'm hoping you can now see a new graphic with a black and a red line. And if that's not the case, Claude, please let me know.
No, we're fine. We're fine.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to look now. These graphics take place through the entire year. In fact, before doing that, I'm just going to look at something else which I'll otherwise forget. This is just the overall value of transactions, montant, for the entire year 2020 now. Just the as promised earlier, full year extension of the initial graphic that I showed you early on for the lockdown period. Essentially, the story is the same. I'll just draw attention to the fact that as we extend the data sample through the entire year 2020, we observe that this is the period that I drew your attention to, the initial lockdown, which was unanticipated and severe, and we see these very large declines in overall expenditure. We see that as the restrictions were eased in mid-June, things returned to some semblance of normal. A further lockdown was instituted towards the end of the year, and we see further effects of this type, and then we see recovery. So that's just the story that we've already told. Here we have, however, with respect to sectoral results, something new. So I'm going to draw attention, I guess, to some sectors that are near the beginning of the alphabet in French, so that I don't have to flip through too many graphics. So we're going to look at groceries, aliments or alimentation, which should be here. So this is, again, a story that I've already told you. Groceries are something where we cannot do intertemporal substitution. We need food fairly soon. Having it next month is no good. So here are the weeks of the year as we go through 2020. Here we are in the initial phase of the lockdown, and we see that grocery purchases actually increased as restaurants were closed, or largely closed, or restricted in the ways in which they could serve customers. I believe that takeout was still allowed in most places. But we see the online sales increasing in percentage terms, let me note, very, very rapidly. But this was a relatively small absolute amount of grocery purchases. But so for something of this type where intertemporal substitution is essentially impossible, we see that the movement towards online allowed people to avoid some trips into the stores, but the good itself had to be obtained. People needed to obtain food. So it was simply a question of which of the shopping channels, online or offline, point of sale or online, people were using. And there's clear substitution towards online purchases. Now, so this is just élément inventaire. I would have to consult someone in the audience for the meaning of the word inventaire, which I can't remember. Here's what I want to draw attention to. I think this is one of the most interesting sectors to look at, because here we are seeing both intertemporal and online-offline substitution. So we're observing here, we think, two ways in which consumers adapted to the shock, mitigated the impact of the shock, and thereby reduced the overall impact on the economy of the shock. So we're seeing indicators of consumer adaptation that increases the resilience of the economy, leading to fewer, that is, the adaptation leading to fewer overall lost sales. So here is the peak containment period that I've been referring to primarily today. Red is point of sale or offline sales. Things are burbling along, nothing much is changing. Sales essentially stop dead for appliances during this period. They're non-essential and the stores are closed. It takes a little while for consumers to adapt, but then online sales increase very rapidly, approximately a 300% increase through this period of where they were in the previous year. Again, most sales were not taking place online, so a 300% is nonetheless not making up all lost sales. But here is the other aspect of this that we find interesting. As we pass through the end of the containment period, through mid-June, we're seeing that point of sale sales of appliances are also above their baseline level in the previous year. So people who could not buy the new washing machine through here may, in some cases, bought it online, in some cases waited and bought it later. And we see these lost sales through this period. Again, the areas are not meaningful here because these are percentage increases. So the black line bumping up like this does not represent recouping all of these lost sales. Some of these lost sales here are recouped later. People just waited and made the purchases later. So the area lost under here, this approximately trapezoid in here, can be compared to the area here, roughly. And we see that a substantial proportion of these lost sales here are recouped in the weeks following the pandemic lockdown. So that the impact effect on the economy here is greater than the integral of the effect, even over a few months later. Intertemporal substitution is allowing consumers to make up these purchases, and the total impact on the economy is lower than it would otherwise have been. And that's taking place through intertemporal substitution, and it's taking place through online substitution. We see, in fact, that the intertemporal substitution is spread out over a substantial period of time, with the exception of this blip in here. You might roughly see this as a line kind of going down here. Here we're in, I guess, I was going to say the summer, although the main touring season in France is through here, but of course last year wasn't really taking place. We see that this recouping of lost sales is roughly speaking taking place through the late fall, at which point the second lockdown took place. And again, there's some recouping of sales just in the last weeks of the year following this. So I think this is a very interesting thing, because the appliances are indicative of durable goods where delay of purchasing is important, and we can measure the recouping of lost sales, so the reduction in the overall impact on the economy through consumers' adaptation. I don't have much time, so I won't look at other sectors such as restaurants, travel, and so on. But what you see in these cases is that you simply can't, hotels are closed or restaurants are closed. You can't perform intertemporal substitution in many cases, and so the scope for consumers making these adjustments is not visible. You see this same effect to some extent in things like clothing and footwear, but it's relatively striking, I would say, in very clear durable goods such as appliances. Okay.
John?
Yes.
Is 15 minutes okay for?
Yeah, I'm nearly finished. 10 minutes, I think I'll be done. I can see I could see my time again there. Thank you, Claude.
Okay.
Okay, so just one other thing that I think is, again, I find very, very interesting. And here there's there's been a bit of an optimistic message, let me say, in some of what we've seen so far, in that consumers are able to adapt and in doing so, reduce the impact of the shock on themselves and on the economy as a whole. There's another kind of impact that we think we've observed. Again, we have fairly early results on this, but which may possibly have some negative effects. And I don't want to make too much of this, but we're investigating this. And that is an interregional effect. So we measure interregional consumer trade simply by looking at transactions by consumers based in département I, but made in département J. Okay, so we can track, because we have a home département that we've defined, we can track purchases outside the home département or home region. Home county might be an analogy if you're from the States. I guess they're bigger than counties. And we can look at the ways in which interregional trade is affected. So what do we observe and what implication do we draw from it? Well, first of all purchases, I don't have time to spend a lot of time on this definition, but just take this as a measure of interregional trade, and note that we have a directed measure. Someone from I buying from J, okay? So someone from J buying from I is not the same thing. We also use a symmetric measure, but I'm just going to talk about this directed measure for now, given the short time. We see that interregional purchases are way down during this period. Point of sale, as we would have expected from the mobility results, point of sale interregional purchases, so in-person regional purchases, interregional purchases, way, way down, almost dropping to zero in April. Online at first, as online purchases in general were down, but then they start to claw their way back up, and in fact, they're up online. Now, one thing that we think we may be observing, let me just make sure I don't miss any of these points. So these are the point of sale purchases require that the individual, of course, was physically present in another département. So obviously that was restricted a great deal. And so obviously the point of sale purchases are down. So we're seeing a shift in interregional trade toward online, which remained possible. The point of sale purchases were severely curtailed and the online went up. Now, here is the point that we think is potentially interesting and potentially worrisome. I don't know if I have a slide on this or not. No, I don't. So I'll just say it verbally. We have in another paper some indications that this, I don't want to make too much of this, but some indications that this may be leading to greater concentration of economic activity in the larger département or in some particular département. And I'll just give you an example to illustrate the kind of effect that we believe we're seeing. So let's imagine you're buying a shirt, let's say, okay? And you live in some small town in southern France, or you live in Saint-Malo in the north or something of this type. You want to buy a shirt, you go out to a store or wherever you normally shop, you buy a shirt, fine. So the purchase takes place in Provence or in Saint-Malo or quoi que ce soit. Now, let's say that the stores are closed and you're buying online. Well, you are now much more likely to buy from one of the very large retailers, which is likely to have a large warehouse, probably somewhere in the region of Paris or some other very large city from which your purchase will be shipped. So a purchase that would have been made in a store near you in Saint-Malo may now be made in from a big warehouse near Paris. Okay, so we believe that we're observing indications in the data, which I don't have time to present to you, of increasing concentration of regional economic activity as purchases move online. That will be something I think very interesting and important to monitor as time goes on. So I'll just give a quick summary of the things that we're trying to study and which I hope are interesting to you. So these detailed transaction data are not only valuable for real-time monitoring. The real-time monitoring is important, yes, but there are also other interesting things going on, and they tell us about what to me are very, very important phenomena for us to be concerned about, in particular, the resilience of the economy, the response to shocks, the ways that consumer adaptation can help mitigate shocks, and possibly long-term changes in the nature of the economy, the effects of which we will need to think about. Okay, research question 1, how were consumers' movement affected? Well, we've seen that. Restricting movements was supposed to be a key channel by which this was to work, and it did work. The containment policies made quite dramatic reductions in consumer movements. How could consumers mitigate the effects? Well, there's clear evidence that they moved to online shopping over time. I haven't presented to you all of the full year evolution of these things, but there is clear evidence that the move to online shopping accelerated through the year. So interregional retail trade, point of sale purchases declined dramatically. Online out of region purchases increased after the initial weeks, and that went on through the year. What were the differential effects across different consumer sectors? Well, they differed a lot by sector. So the essential sectors show very small point of sale effects and even positive ones. Non-essential sectors show dramatic reductions point of sale. And these suggest that the containment restrictions were very well respected with respect to the closing of retailers. For durables, we're seeing indications of this substitution, such as I just indicated. So if anyone has comments, ideas, thoughts, we certainly would welcome them. Here are our email addresses. 2 of the 3 working papers are available on SSRN or Cyrano. So there's a paper on interregional trade, and there is the our first study of the effects of the containment lockdown. There's a 3rd study on sectoral effects, which is not written yet, but which we hope to have completed before too long. So thank you for your attention.